I'm going to hand you over to Hans Hancock, who's going to be your host for today. Thanks very much, Hans.
I'm Hans Hancock, one of the co-founders and editors of Saturation.
Can everybody hear?
Not very well, no.
Okay, then just move it.
I'm one of the co-editors of Saturation Point, the online magazine, and I'd like to introduce you to the panel today. We have Rana Begum, who is inspired by the everyday clutter of London and makes beautiful objects, wall-hung objects. And we have Jonathan Parsons, who exhibited the Charles Saatchi exhibition Sensation at the Royal Academy. We have John Carter, who's known for his abstract sculptures.
Just pull it towards you.
And we have John Carter, who's best known for his abstract sculptures, and his work frequently described as being dialogue between painting and sculpture. Now, lives and works in London, and has 2 solo exhibitions at the Redfern Gallery and a solo show at the Royal Academy. Richard Plank, whose work is rooted in elements of the modern movement. He does hard edge abstract and makes use of contemporary materials and modern techniques such as laser etching, engraving, cutting, and 3D printing. Peter Lowe, who's constructing geometric reliefs in the 1960s and uses mathematics and systems. And in front we have Leslie Botts, who does installation using colour and it's exhibited widely in the UK and abroad. We have Natalie Dower, whose interest in the work of her colleagues Malcolm Hughes and Michael Kidman led on to making work using constructivism, again using mathematics and science to stimulate her ideas.
My name's Philip Dalton. I hope you can hear me. I've got a much louder voice, which is probably not a good thing in social relationships, but useful in these occasions. Let me explain what we want to do. I mean, conventionally, audiences have a responsibility, and it's to be silent, to laugh, to clap, to cry. This is a different occasion, and we'd like to make you part of the conversation. So, on the other hand, my insistence is that if you do contribute, you contribute with the eloquence of Billie Holiday and not much longer. So I don't want any Hamlet-like speeches. It's a pleasure to have this wild and very different generationally composed panel with me. You know, there are people who are at art school in the 90s, and there are people who are at art school in the 50s, and at most generations in between. So it's not simply that we've got a panel, but we've got a history, and it may be we've got a number of histories. I'm just going to, before I start by asking questions, I'm just going to make 3 observations which I hope are helpful. One is, as I look at the work around the room and as I know the work of these people, there is no essence to this work. It was Wittgenstein who famously said, there is no essence, there is simply family resemblance. So the really interesting question is whether these people do actually belong to a family or belong to families. The second is, there's a wonderful quotation, or a wonderful line from W.H. Auden in his poem on the death of Yeats, where he said, "The words of the dead are modified in the guts of the living." The words of the dead are modified in the guts of the living. And whatever the origins of these movements are, they're endlessly modified as history and individuals transform them. And the third question, which I would like to come to at the end, is, as I read the press release for this and read different observations, there are many different ways of describing this: geometric, reductive, constructivist. But I also remember there's a wonderful quotation by that old English radical William Morris, who said sometimes you have to ditch a word and fight for the word under a new, fight for the practice under a new banner. And so one of the things I'd like to come to at the end is the degree to which actually whatever we see on the walls and whatever these people practice, whether actually in 2015 we need to find a new vocabulary to describe it, which actually, as you can tell, is what I believe. I spend a week a month in China, so my world is partly shaped by that sense, and I've just done a big retrospective in Shanghai of Sean Scully, who in the early 70s might well have found himself on a panel like this. But the reason I mention this is China is now getting very, very, very interested in abstract art, both in Western and its own tradition of abstract art. In fact, some of my toughest Chinese friends always tell me that after all, abstract expressionism was simply unimaginable outside Chinese ink painting. And when you look at Robert Motherwell and others, you can see there's truth in that. So we gather together at a moment when abstract art isn't simply being reassessed in the West, the two Malevich shows that have been on, but actually is globally being rethought. And I think that's a very interesting moment. So I want to begin by asking each of the panel just very briefly to tell us when they first encountered work like this and why it mattered to them. Richard? Even for that.
That's not too bad. I can speak quite loudly.
Yeah, you're a noisy one.
I am a noisy 1, 2, 1, 2. I don't think that's on anyone. For me, it was quite simple, really. It was around about the late 60s when I first went to art college, and I had a very academic training, which was unusual even in those days at Harrow School of Art. And I first came across this kind of abstract work. And the first thing that hit me was just the visual power and newness to it. And I was fortunate enough to also be trained by a number of the people who made this work when they were young, fresh, exciting artists. And it changed my life over the course of the next few years. And I still believe the work is as fresh and strong now as it was back in the 70s, 60s, 70s. My own focused development then became more European movement.
Well, then we'll come on to that in a moment.
Quite right.
Jonathan?
Well, I was having to think about this after you asked that question, and I guess one of my first encounters with these kinds of things was the Herbert Reed History of Painting, where there was a kind of visual essay at the back of this book, and notably in there were the curtain paintings of Richter and Richard Smith's work. And my primary interest at the time was with the work of Jasper Johns, with his sort of systematic look at what Leo Steinberg called the flatbed picture plane. And Smith seemed to be related to that kind of idea of the painting as an object. But then I think my first real encounter with the works themselves was probably an exhibition of the drawings of Sol LeWitt at the then Museum of Modern Art, Oxford. And this pretty much brought together every series of investigations that he'd made, both in terms of drawings as works in themselves, but also as tools for the creation of further objects and series. And they published this fabulous catalogue of every single thing that was on display. So that was a serious encounter with those objects.
Rana?
I think for me, I mean, I came from kind of a more representational background.
And everybody here.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I remember, I think, one day kind of being in the library during my foundation course and flicking through books, and a couple of those artists were Anish Kapoor and Donald Judd, and I remember just looking at their work and just being amazed by it, but not really understanding the work, and then finally seeing Judd's work at the Tate, it was, I mean, that I think was my kind of moment of like, okay, this is where I want to kind of go down the path. And I think from there, that's where kind of my search kind of started, and the process of kind of moving towards that.
John?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. I find this an incredibly difficult question, and I also suffer from false memory syndrome as well. So I think I've sort of always known about abstraction. You know, one knew about Mondrian, one had seen it in the books. But I must say, when I was a student, and this is in the late 50s, modern art, abstract art, was something that had happened before the war and didn't seem to exist anymore. It was sort of Ben Nicholson, Barbara Hepworth, and so on. And it had all happened before the war, whereas what was happening in the art schools was all to do with social realism and the world of John Berger and so on. But I found a little book again in the art school library called 9 Abstract Artists. And I remember being absolutely fascinated by the work of Anthony Hill and Mary Martin. I was interested in other things at the time. I wasn't influenced by it at that time, but it came in later. But it was a very, very strong thing.
In my time, 1954, I started at art school, and Kenneth Martin, who was one of the best teachers there, brought in a book called Kälte Kunst, with a question mark, which meant cold art. In those days, it was common for people to dismiss it by saying it's cold and clinical. You don't want to get involved with that. It's cold and clinical. And the French had a word for that, which was abstraction froide, cold art. So if you did that sort of work, I suppose you couldn't expect to be particularly rewarded for it.
And you were.
Eventually. But may I just say a few words about the book Kälte Kunst by Karl Gerstner? It was in German, of course, but then the illustrations in this book were of work by Max Biel, Richard Paul Lohse, Campbell Preiser, Marcel Weiss, who their works were analysed and deconstructed, I think is the word I'm looking for, so that they spoke really eloquently of structure and system and order. And I'd never come across anything quite like that before. And it had a tremendous impact on me at age 16 or 17. And also, at that time, abstract art was something that was not encouraged, because like Dick and like Rana, I had an academic training, lifelong mostly.
Two of you have mentioned European, and there's a famous essay by E.P. Thompson called The Peculiarities of the English. How far did you feel when you were thinking about making your own work now, rather than looking at someone else's, that you needed to make European connections? John?
Very interesting question, actually, that, and it really, I was tremendously influenced by American art, was of my sort of generation. And it was only when I first started showing in Germany that I really made the connection with the things that I was interested in, that were not American, essentially. They were something else. I mean, I like to think that art is international, really. I don't like the building up of nationalisms in that way. But I certainly have made no attempt to make English art.
What do you think English art is, just briefly, John?
Yes,
You have half a minute.
That's a good
well,
question.
Ivan Hitchens.
Ivan Hitchens. That's fine. That will do as a reference. That will do as a reference for you. Same question, Richard, to you.
It's the first powerful influence to me, a name mentioned before, was Sol LeWitt. When I was at Brighton College of Art, I was doing multilinear drawings. So American influence, and of course one couldn't avoid being influenced by all the American contemporary art that was going on. Then slowly, I became aware of European movements. Obviously one finds Mondrian, perhaps the first, and then built up through Russian constructivism, the style Dutch movement, art concrete, and lastly with myself, very focused introduction to the English Systems Group and the Constructionists, with the marvellous Anthony Hill, of course. And that is where I first had the pleasure of meeting my friend Peter Lowe. So it built up from American influences to a knowledge of European movements.
Peter?
The first name that comes to me, of course, is Max Biel, architect, painter, sculptor, theoretician, educator. But like Descartes, art concrete art, systems, artists like Georges van Tongerloo, the Belgian sculptor, and also Kenneth and Mary Martin. Mary Martin especially, because Mary Martin did a very short course at Goldsmiths and packed it with information and was very good communicator.
I've left the two youngsters on the panel till last, partly because that moment of the tension between European and American is transformed much later. You know, by the time you two get to art school, you're both 1990s children in art school terms, in a way that the old conflicts are kind of different. They've been formulated remarkably different. Suddenly the world is much more porous. You know, the world is no longer America, Europe and England, but a much wider. Rana, you.
Actually, that's quite interesting what you just said, because when I was at art school, especially at Chelsea, I didn't really feel that kind of separation. And for me, it was kind of almost absorbing as much as I could possibly absorb, and you know, having people like John and Trevor and Tess was brilliant, because you know, these were the people that I, you know, after discovering Judd and Mary Martin and you know, Kenneth Martin and a lot of the constructivist artists, it was really amazing to kind of meet people who were actually also working along those same kind of language. And yeah, I mean, it was fantastic having Gary Woodley kind of and John kind of being there and kind of helping to understand that language, because that's what I was really struggling with kind of during that period.
It's an interesting point, which is the encounter, the pedagogic encounter, is important to everybody, one way or another. And sometimes the pedagogic encounter can take place between yourself and a book. It doesn't necessarily have to be a kind of person.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. In my experience, it's the story that was told. So when I realised I was going to be studying art, I think I was probably about 16 when I first realised that's what I was going to do. And the story was of, if you want to talk about, I mean, I agree that abstraction is international, but if I want to talk about this idea of European art, the story that was told was of Europe going to America. Pete Mondrian arriving in New York.
So you were still taught that in the 90s?
Well, this is
Charming tradition.
when one's doing one's further education. There was still that trajectory, but there are people like John Hoyland's curating shows of Hans Hofmann at Tate, and I remember seeing that when I was studying before I did my foundation. So those kinds of things were very formative. So the sort of the more hot art than the cool art was something that seemed to chime in with what artists were doing at that time in the late 80s.
I want to come back to this and to the generational field, because art isn't only made in relationship to other art, but in relationship to the wider history, whether it's in the 50s or the 70s or the 90s or now. But as one thing, as I walked around this exhibition, because the things that I thought about, and as I know in different ways the work of all these people, the thing I think about isn't structure or geometry. Actually, it's colour, which of course is the very opposite from the cold art, that, as it were. So I want, if we can, and if you want to now interject, you're now, the teacher's giving you permission to interject, is I'm interested in how and why colour matters to you. Peter?
Well, I suppose one reason it matters is that it can be systematized. There are many systems for artists like Munsell Colour Atlas, Ostwald Colour Notations, and if, as we were, interested in retrieving the procedures underlying the system, then somehow if a form was going to be systematized, then so the colour must also.
Nothing about emotion.
Oh, no.
No, I wouldn't. That's it. I wouldn't want you to.
No, that's a marvellous thing to bring up. People feel perhaps that paintings like The Crying Gypsy are absolutely packed with emotion, and the kind of work we do is not like The Crying Gypsy painting. But I have feelings about ideas and ideas about feelings, and the two things are not separate.
It's a great quote from Pascal, that old Calvinist in the 17th century, who said, "The heart has reasons, reason knows not of." You know what I mean? And that mix between them. John, what about you and colour? Because you're as chaste as I can think.
I'd rather not have to answer that. It's one of immense difficulty for me. Basically, I think more like Animal Farm. One colour good, two colours not so good, three colours worse.
I'm wary of colour getting in the way of what it is I'm trying to structure. I want colour to divert the attention from the patterns of structures of theme and variation that I'm working with.
Why?
Because it can have a separate emotional response that I don't particularly want. It can lead one astray from the core of the work. But of course it is integral, it is incredibly important. So it's difficult using colour for me, it is not easy.
Are certain colours easier than certain other colours?
I don't know.
Fine. Jonathan?
It's incredibly hard, but for me, it's the stuff of everyday experience. We experience colours all the time, unless we've got physiological problems. And I've made a systematic study of colour, and I think using systems in the studio and working on colour names, for example, ways of categorising colour, that's a way of dealing with this kind of possibility of feeling that you're going to be completely overwhelmed by colour. And so...
It's interesting, two phrases. Led astray, which makes me think of religion. Do you know what I mean? As if colour is some sin, that one can be led astray and overwhelmed, and you don't have to be a Freudian to think overwhelmed is an interesting term to use.
But it's absolutely essential. And what I mean by that is when you make a study of colour, it gets into you and it crawls around inside you and it sort of takes over your thinking. I mean, for me, colour and structure are the same thing.
It's really interesting because that's kind of quite similar to how I feel now with my work. I feel like I can't actually ignore colour. It is part of the form, the light. That's all those elements that are in my work. But I remember, at a time during my degree, actually really struggling with colour, just in finding incredibly difficult. I mean, for a start, I couldn't really mix. Every time I mixed something, it just ended up being really muddy and mucky. And so it was something that I knew that I couldn't do. And I didn't know whether because I didn't understand it and that every time I tried painting, it just looked really horrible. Visually, it just didn't look right.
And how did you know that?
I think it was like looking at my work that I did during my degree, and looking back, I realised that it was something I needed to really spend quite a bit of time, and I knew that paint wasn't a way for me to understand colour, and that's when I suddenly realised I was collecting materials that already had colour, that already had some kind of form, and so by using those that I became to understand colour, and now I can kind of combine those kind of research together. But it is, I mean, I hadn't realised how difficult it was, and how, when you do get it, how free you become to be able to use all of those things together.
Needing to interrupt you, I just mean to add to this. I think for people who work mainly with a sculptural kind of structure, which you do and I do, it's an entirely different issue from colour in painting. And it's very hard to talk about this. I have in mind to write a treatise, Carter's treatise on colour, but one day I'll get round to it. Because with objects, it's also, with sculpture, but also the quality of the material is extremely primary, I think. And whether you're using the natural colour of the material or whether you're painting it, as both Roman and I do, there is still this awareness of what the material is, although it's a very complex issue.
I mean, just going from that point, I mean, it was kind of, I mean, I didn't really plan to kind of, the way my work's developed, I didn't really think like, okay, I'm going to kind of do this first and then that. It just naturally, when I really stripped back and tried to think about what it was that I was interested in, the first thing that came to my mind was light and form. And so those were the things that I started kind of researching during my degree. And then later on, it was like, okay, hang on a sec, the work isn't just about light and form. Actually, colour is part of that, because throughout the day, the work is changing, because of the way the light falls. And the reason it's changing is because the colour is embodied in the work, embodied in light. And so that's when I was like, okay, I do actually need to kind of focus. And then seeing those things come together, colour became light, colour became surface. So it was really difficult to take it apart, kind of almost separate it, if you like.
The way I was going to bring, if I may, Natalie and Lota. Neither will be embarrassed to be told that Natalie was an art school student in the 50s and Lota in the 90s. But Natalie, in the sense, you and John may have some of the same preoccupation.
I'm not quite so puritanical. One thing that nobody has mentioned with regard to colour.
Forgive me, can you stand up now?
Yes, I will. Perhaps I can face the other way, yes. One thing that hasn't been mentioned so far is that colour really is, as far as I'm concerned, relationships. The same colour provided with another colour will look completely different. It's like a game of chess. So I'm I find colour very difficult, but it does seem to rely entirely on relationships rather than the colour itself. A question was asked about whether there was a favourite colour or a difficult colour. I find blue a difficult colour because blue is with associations with the sea, the sky. It is very difficult to get blue to be actually concrete. So I do find that a difficulty.
Well, I mean, I find what you just said with the point with the relationship very, very interesting, because I mean, I often have them, particularly with the work of the wall paintings where color is very important. That when I start somewhere, I always think I've used all colors, there aren't enough colors, and I found this quite difficult because I love color and I have a very personal relationship to colors. And I start first with a very, very personal approach to color, where I try to avoid all theories, which is difficult, but all kind of systematical approach. But then halfway through, I swap into a more systematical approach, and this is when I start to fit one color to another one, when these relationships are starting. And that's a entirely different process. And this process always then suddenly so extreme relief when I think then there are enough colors. You have to just put them in a different context.
It just seems as though we all find it a deep and complex problem to deal with.
Well, if you didn't, you wouldn't be good artists. I don't find colour a problem because I'm a very, very bad painter. You know, I mean, it may be a sense, it's like, you know, friends of mine who are writers, they say words are the most slippery, impossible things in the world. I want, if we can, now to broaden it, and then I'll bring the audience in. So this is the time we have to think up some smart questions. I want to think about the category of abstract art. Some of you grew up at a time, as I did, when either you were for it or against it. I think it was John who mentioned John Berger. You know, you either were for it or against it. It was either a capitalist plot. I'm parodying John, who was a very interesting writer. There are others where it's just one of the choices that's available to you. I just wonder now whether you think the term abstract art just really isn't helpful.
I think it's unhelpful. Van Doesburg proposed concrete as opposed to abstract, an antonym, which makes sense to me, because all art, in a sense, is an abstraction from the visual world or from experience. At one end of the spectrum, you have a dot. And it's hard to make a simpler drawing than a dot on a white sheet of paper. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have the object itself. You have the waxwork, you have the iconic object that you can immediately relate. And a waxwork is about as far as you can go towards realism. I mean, you can't have the smell, you can't have the warmth of the body, but you have the object itself, and the extremes of abstraction are impurity. You can't go beyond simplification. And people like Mondrian have played with simplification by, for example, not allowing diagonals or secondary colours to occur. And there's a parallel with literature with the group Oulipo. Oulipo included Marcel Duchamp, but it also included writers like Raymond Queneau, and Raymond Queneau and his colleagues would play with literary constraints, like they would not use the letter E, for example, or they would refuse to use the letters with ascenders or descenders, and they would manage to write novels Perret wrote. Well, I think that's enough.
Well,
Is it unhelpful?
I really respond to this word concrete, because everything, even if it's a dot on a piece of paper, is stuff. It's material stuff, and that's what we as artists have to deal with. At least the artists around this table work with real material things. But in terms of art theory and reading and such, I mentioned Leo Steinberg earlier, and his book Other Criteria used this term flatbed to describe Rauschenberg and Johns' work in particular, and Robert Ryman to some extent, which was a term, the term flatbed cut across, and he specifically says this, it cuts across the terms abstract and figurative, and it was much more to do with the image as an object, the artwork as a thing. So I think if it's abstraction from what? A piece of text is a very abstract thing. When you read a word, that seems to dematerialize, it seems to float away from the support that it's on as you apprehend the word. So that to me is a much more abstract thing, like a number.
John?
Endless arguments about terminology in this field, and I noticed that the current Whitechapel catalogue of the Black Square exhibition, Ilona Buzwick used the word abstraction all the way through to apply to Malevich. Now, it seems to me to be incorrect. I think abstraction means something that is abstracted or extracted from something else. And I mean, Malevich is an enigmatic artist in lots of ways, but I think the whole point of the Black Square was its reality as a black square, not that it was abstracted from something else.
So if I call you an abstract, what do you do? Half the picture.
Well, we have to use these terms to distinguish them from, a figurative painter. So I think it's okay to use it in a loose way, but if we start being exact, then I think it's completely the wrong word, and concrete is better.
Well, I agree, John. Yeah,
The key phrase is abstraction from. So one thing is tree, pier, and ocean. These are abstractions from, but become sources of composition.
I think we all agree on this one.
It's so true. I mean, if you kind of...
But you're young enough, forgive me, I have to cast you all in different ways. You're young enough for this, John just used the figurative or abstraction, which means he belongs to a certain generation.
I know.
I'm not sure you have to worry.
No, but it makes me cringe. It makes me cringe when, certain terminology is used to describe my work, and I feel like, it just basically closes doors for you. And I think, John's right in terms of, if you're using it loosely to kind of describe word and describe to people who may not actually understand the language that you're using, it's okay. But then if you're kind of really going kind of deep into the work, I don't think it is something, concrete. It's much more, and something that's much more pure, I feel. It's, there's a lot of words that's quite cringing for me when people use.
I was just going to say one way around this might be to distinguish between informal abstract art and formal abstract art, and I think most of us are dealing with formal abstract art rather than free expressionist approach.
If we look back historically, Malevich is inevitably mentioned. There was a kind of utopian dimension to that abstract art. Now, my Methodist teachers taught me that repentance is unlike innocence. In other words, there's no way back to that earlier moment. So I suppose I want, and I'm going to bring Natalie and Lothar as well, and this, the degree to which when you think of your loyalty to the kind of work you make, and you have made, and some of you have been making it a long time, so there's a kind of a the quality of a marriage or a long-term marriage about this relationship. Do you still think of it as utopian, John?
I don't think we're entitled to think of it in the same way that the abstract, not the abstract, that the Russians did, and the idealism of that came into the post-war period. I just don't think we have that anymore, and I would like to have it, but I don't.
What do you have if you don't have that?
Well, I have my commitment to the work, which also involves an aspect of sort of pseudo-scientific research almost, and the excitement of exploration and the interest. I mean, it's the most interesting thing in the world, I think. But the politics, I can't do that anymore.
As Peter's mentioned, the work can often be cold, soulless, and lifeless. And in fact, I think it's always been the very opposite for me. It's distilled, focused, it has to be lasered, but underlying it as a deep, deep passion and intensity. Now, it isn't of a particular order, it isn't religious, it isn't political, it's hard to know how to say it. It's an intense inquiry into human existence. There are different ways of looking at that, but it is there, if not utopian or political.
Inquiry scientific. They're cognate terms.
I would accept the word scientific in some ways.
I was just thinking of the excitement of making a discovery about certain things to do with form. And that brings it close to mathematics, and you can share information with mathematicians and they can take you further, because I'm not a mathematician, but my work's benefited from the input of mathematicians.
Natalie? Sorry.
Very much agree with that. I am no mathematician at all, but I found very exciting the extraordinary things that happen when you use quite basic rules of mathematics. I've sometimes thought that my ignorance has been a benefit, and that I can get excited about things like root to rectangles and Fibonacci series, numbers and things. And I then play around with them, and I find that totally unexpected things happen. And I find that very exciting. I think if you aren't excited about what you're doing, you're not going to do anything which is going to interest anybody else.
That there's a kind of scientific paradigm, that one works within.
I think the program is fine, and I echo what Dick says. That you have to commit yourself to the practice, you have to engage in research, and it is kind of a.
What is the compulsion?
Well, it's a confrontation with reality. It can also be a refuge. And I think as a sideline, it necessarily has to be apolitical and asocial and on its own terms. It's certainly a compulsion.
Could I just come in for a moment? If you're trained as a figurative artist, drawing from the motif, from nature, from the figure, this is the objective kind of study which backs up the work. But I feel in constructive work, often it's a mathematical or a scientific aspect, which is the objective part, which is not, it's like studying nature or something. Yeah, I mean, that's clear.
The idea that the analogy to the figure is the mathematical system. Lothar?
Well, I still find the that aspect of having a vision also quite important. I mean, to me, I think that the process when you, I mean, I struggled my whole life, what is abstraction, and I really don't know what it actually is in the end. And I know it now less than when I was a student, I think. But I think that moment where you abstract an idea or something which you've seen or your experience in the world, you transform it into a piece of work or something, that has something visionary in itself. But not in that I completely agree with this. I found it difficult, not in this kind of making a statement, this political aspect, whatever in the Bauhaus or at that period, early modernism was very clear to do, and they had to do it because they had to justify themselves against lots of enemies or so. That was clear. I mean, I don't have that any longer, and I think this is very difficult nowadays because that has changed completely. But this kind of personal vision, this personal utopia, that for me still exists.
Yeah, I agree. I think, at that period, because of the transition from kind of the representational to something that was new, it was kind of almost needed. I feel, I don't know, I mean, our generation, I don't think we feel that struggle. And I think that's where, it's...
Tell me what you don't feel. What do you feel?
I think you feel kind of struggle within in terms of kind of your own research, if you like, your own kind of what it is that you're trying to discover within your own work. I don't think in terms of as a body, it's not that.
Sorry, I was going to say that I want to bring people in, so you could just simply wait until the microphone is reaching.
If you put your hands up further.
Hello, I'm Timothy Hyman. I'm a painter and writer. Just when I walked through the Judd retrospective at the Tate, it definitely had a utopian air. So it's not entirely generational. I mean, is that right? I mean, Donald Judd wasn't that much older than some people at the table, if older at all. So, I mean, the loss of the utopia, I think it's a good question, if it has been lost.
Been lost a bit. I think we've, I don't know, I mean, if you look at kind of a lot of the artists, young artists these days, I think it's, I don't know, I feel like it's become a lot more about the self rather than kind of, I don't know if you agree, but it's... Yeah, and it being kind of, I mean, there is definitely, some of the subjects that may be dealing with are social and political, but I feel, the self takes priority in terms of, the work, than a language that brings people together. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
I hope these are all continuing.
Yes, hi, I'm Sue Hubbard. I'm a writer. On art, and among other things. I'm really interested in your last remark about art about the self, because for me as a writer, that's one of the problems about where art has arrived at. We're talking, people like John are talking about sort of 50s abstraction and systems painting, all these things. And at a certain point in modernism, it seemed fine to move away from the figure because, the world was in chaos. The figure was sort of something absolute, and what people wanted to do was to experiment, religious faith was going and all the things that we learn about. But one of the things that I was really taken with is, as artists talking about the use of materials and colour, there was this, people were talking about different systems and things. And then people kept on saying, well, you sort of know when it's right. Now, for me, I want to know, what is this right? Is it a moral right? Is it purely an aesthetic right? And if that, what's that based on? And I think that that's one of the problems that we have, we've come to at this point, how we assess what is right.
different ways. There are different groups assessing what is right. There's a critical rightness. There's the rightness as you're making the work. There's the rightness in the particular historical moment in which it's made, a different moment in which it's received, a different, yeah. John, how do you know something's right?
Well, one of the key things about systematic art is that if you have set up the system, you must follow it through. So, in a sense, it sidesteps that issue, I think.
So choosing the right system
is where that begins. At the same time, you find that if 12 artists were using the same system to create something, you'd come up with 12 different work, because we each have our own kind of aesthetic. And I think you can't avoid that.
Isn't that just it's not actually right? It can't be right, because if it was right, you would just stop. I mean, that's the whole point of it. It's never really right, and that's why you continue that.
It's that great man of fail again, fail better.
I think that this problem of when is a work finished, that's a problem for figurative painters as well. It's not unique to systems art, but if something starts out and goes through a logical sequence until it completes a cycle, then maybe you could say the work ends there. But the decision to end the work is, I think it's hard to escape taste and arbitrariness. It's something I hate, and it's something I would try to avoid.
You have to choose the material.
You still have to choose, yes.
And you have what it does. Yes.
But there might be...
What size should it be?
Yes.
Both of you are using the term right, I suppose, to pick up Sue's term, in aesthetic terms. Yes. There's no moral dimension to this. Is there, Richard?
It has to end up pleasing my eye. It must look balanced and beautiful, which might be seen completely separately from the way it has been constructed. So there are two things. It has to look good. It has to be aesthetically pleasing. It has to fulfill the way it has been constructed. And that, of course, is a very personal issue.
And the other thing is, coming to the point at which you decide that you're happy enough to show it to somebody else, to be exposed by putting your work on display. That's one measure of it. But I would go back and echo that I think it has to be, in a sense, ahistorical, amoral, apolitical, asocial. But in a way, that decision to show is always an experiment in whether the personal can become communal, can become a shared experience.
I'm quite interested in kind of expanding in terms of what you... Sorry, I'm just interested in you kind of expanding on that a little bit in terms of, how you feel kind of finishing a piece of work. I mean, for me, I don't feel like they're ever finished, because there's always something more. You discover, you do a piece of work and it's not quite complete because there's something else, that
But
makes
isn't that
it...
the practice as a whole?
That's the practice as a whole, but that also as kind of individual works that you're producing, I don't think they're ever actually complete. I don't think they're ever actually finished in terms of physically...
There's a difference between finished and rough.
Yes. Well, I think they kind of go together a little bit, because... I don't know, that's kind of what I'm understanding from the panel. They kind of go together a little bit, but for me, they're never finished. Whether they're right or not, it's really up to the viewer, because to me it might seem, okay, I think there's not really anything more that I can do with this piece of work. The only way I can do something more is to move on to the next one.
Because you're
And
right,
that's-
the artist is just the first viewer.
Yeah.
You know, it was Barth who said the writer is just the first reader.
Yeah, but also, I mean, sorry, kind of like, I don't know, there's something else within that, because the language that we all use, it's a quite universal language. So it's, you know, you're not. I don't know if I'm
You know, I think that one of the things is that you make work that is good enough to satisfy whatever purpose, whatever
the curiosity and enough to kind of put it out there
and to
but
drive you onwards
exactly.
and to show to other people.
Yeah.
I find the sensation of whether a thing is right or finished is very close for me to experience of listening to music. One has a strong feeling, again, there can be differences of opinion about music, but the sensation you get from a piece of music, which is absolutely wonderful, is very much the kind of sensation I've been looking for in trying to decide whether I'd got the painting right or not.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Noker. I'm a writer for Saturation Point and painter. I'd quite like you to draw your attention to the work in the exhibition, in a sense, because I think all the works in the exhibition have a kind of their own utopia and perhaps their own phenomenology. And I think I'm quite drawn into the fact that when you look quite closely at the work, if Bernard's work, for instance, you're really picking up on the kind of the way the handprints kind of give the work a phenomenology. And I get really drawn into the way that's depicted. Because I think, in a sense, that their own personal kind of utopian existence, because you get very drawn into that sort of space, I think. I think it's almost in terms of your own rules, your own systems that you bring to that utopia. Because I think utopia in a way is a good place, but in some ways no place as well. I mean, I just wanted to just talk about Colin's work as well. I mean, I like the fact, very, very briefly, sorry, one thing about that is that he, very, in a serendipity, in a moment of serendipity, he was visited by a friend, a mathematician, and his friend said, God, I like all the scrawls and things you're doing with mathematical thoughts. And he offered to give him the possibility of ringing up his university. And he had the chance every day to sort of ring them and say, here are the kind of algorithms I've sorted out. Here are the rules. Can you use your computer, which was a PC or pre-PC, and work them out for me? So I like that kind of serendipity interwoven with the phenomenology of praxis.
Sorry, I'm Ray Thompson. I'm a painter, and a writer. And I was just thinking about, I've had occasion lately in the context of an exhibition by a very fine artist called Gene Spencer to address the problem of chromophobia and chromophilia as it relates to system or the absence thereof or the problematicity thereof. And there is a kind of trend with the more systematic, the more chromophobic. And I do think that has a kind of religious thing, as you said, Philip. But that's not really my question. My question is that within that tradition particularly, there has been a link to some might call it the utopian thing, but definitely a project of modernity, a kind of enlightenment project, if you like, which many people these days, because it's not as universal as it pretends, it does tend to exclude quite a lot of people. And I just have been speculating about how that might change the politics of reading around this work. And this is a question. Yeah, this is the question, actually. And does it, the fact that that project is now falling apart, does that mean that, that ethos within systematic practice is also falling apart? Thank you.
Relationship between systems and colour, but the more systematic, as it were, the less chromophiliac. The other issue is the much larger issue, which takes us back to Kant and Hegel and late 18th century modernity, although modernism and modernity are very complex related, they're not the same thing. Whether that project, in a sense, has failed. And I suppose I think I should ask each of you this individually, because you have to live through this. John? The question is, I'm doing my best. The question is, if in a sense this arises, this kind of work arises out of the Enlightenment project, to put order into the world. Insofar as that project is now failed, we now live in the post-modern world. Does that change the nature of the academy? Chewing over things we talked about before, we rather eloquently and modestly say, I don't think I have the right. I don't have the right to have those things. Is that because the project of which Malevich was part of itself is failed? So we have to find something more like Brahma suggested, something more personal.
Yes. I mean, there's a sort of implication in a lot of geometric work, particularly that uses golden sections and things. And even in my book, it was written, I don't agree with it, that the world is harmonious, otherwise it wouldn't work. I can't remember who said. And I profoundly disagreed with that, because A, I don't think it works, and B, I don't think it's harmonious. And I think that, particularly dealing with systematic art, it is, you can create things which are not, if you follow a system, the result is not necessarily harmonious. So I don't know how to answer it, but that's what I yes.
Well, there is the dark side of the Enlightenment, which is the Gothic or the imperfect.
Goya is quoted as saying, the dream of reason brings forth monsters. I've had, when we espouse what we purport to be rational, there's also the other side. There's the anti-rational side. And the history of the world, I suppose, the history of modernism, is that you had the rationalists and the anti-rationalists. The anti-rationalists were the surrealists, André Breton, who attacked reason. It's unfortunate that his arguments were self-refuting because he needed logic in order to attack. And then on the other hand, you had the rationalists who were sometimes part of the irrationalist camp. Van Doesburg, Van Doesburg was a rationalist architect and extremely rational painter, but secretly he was I.K. Bonset, and I.K. Bonset was a surrealist, was a Dadaist, more of a Dadaist. And I think constructivism and formalism or formal abstract art can't exist really without the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is just as important. Dada was an anti-war movement. We were living through, well, the previous generations were living through a dystopia, to say the least. And Dada was a reaction to that. It was anti-structure, anti-rationalism. But the rationalists might say, well, the reason why all this happened was a failure of reason. And reason is still the gold standard for science and for debate and discussion. To go the other way is to take the road to madness.
Do you think that's true, Richard?
I think from my point of view, I don't tend to work from or towards a big idea. I think the way I make art is a sort of trying to find a way for some clarity and understanding about our existence, how humans view the world and my place in it. And this kind of work, I have discovered over the years, is the best way that I can begin to do that.
So you work, I forgot what the saying
with
is.
fear and trepidation.
With fear
mostly.
and trepidation is probably better. Rana? What is it Star Wars says, let the dark side? I take it that's part of what is the issue. We've been through a moment with Derrida and Foucault and a whole set of figures where actually the unravelling of those enlightenment and reasonable certainty has become kind of commonplace.
I don't know where to start actually. I can't quite start.
Okay. Sorry, Jonathan.
I think this is the question is connected to the kind of stories we tell ourselves to be able to get a handle on the enormity of everything that happens in history. And I think the flip side of the coin is this idea of metaphysics and transcending the material in a sense, because you could think about traditions and places, times and places where geometrical visual emblems are used as objects of contemplation and as methods to transcend the physical. So that would be my flip side of it: the non-thinking, the empty mind.
Lothar, you come from a German heritage where most of these ideas of enlightenment and anti-enlightenment come from. You were educated.
Well, I mean, when I was still a student in Germany before I came here, the moment of the sublime, and that we were talking about that endless detail, you did not know any longer how to do actually any work, and for me, I had to forget that in some point to be able to start moving again. But I mean, I do find, that question is actually interesting because I do find it more difficult when I want to bring into the work dark sides. This kind of, I found this in the abstract world far more. When I want to do that with shapes, the kind of language I'm using, I find this far more difficult than other subject or other ideas, because it is kind of, it very often ends up just to look elegant, but not dark, and it's quite a challenge. And I find it. For me, I think it's an important aspect of the work, but it's difficult.
Hi. I just had a question to you. You mentioned Solowitz as an influence, and initially I was surprised because this debate is about abstraction. I know you're all questioning that term, but I always connected Solowitz with conceptualism, conceptual art, which tends towards dematerializing art. And I know there's a paradox there because conceptual, we know their work through the physical objects that they made. Anyway, I was wondering if you had something to say around
that. I'd just like to ask the panel, with regards to how this art came about, and a lot of it came about from the social, political, economic environment and the times, and Peter mentioned how Dadaism came throughout the post-war. Do you think that artists nowadays have to fight harder for reasons to make this kind of art?
Soul Wit was a very strong influence. For me, it was the first time I'd seen something hugely, completely different to the sort of art background and training I had. And it kind of blew me away, both visually and to some extent intellectually, how and why can this be made? It was wonderful. And that's really what it was. It introduced me to American minimalism, but it was simply the work itself, the power of it, and the way it was made. Is it any easier or harder in today's world? It's just different. I don't think it's either.
It was as hard as it ever was.
Let's talk soul.
Yeah, it's as hard as it ever was to make work, to be in the position to make work, to get it noticed, to get it exhibited, to get it seen. That's never going to change. But I think, to return to the first question about Solowit, all artwork is the product of human consciousness. So whether you describe that as thinking or conceptual or linguistic or emotional or whatever, it comes out of a personal story. And I see all of that work as I said, being completely material and concrete. It's made of stuff. It's externalized. It's realized. And I think one of the questions for this panel discussion was about the legacy of this work. And the legacy is the work. It's manifestly the artwork that survives and is visible and can be seen.
Yeah, it is the physical material that's, that is kind of, instantly when you see the work you recognise as Solowit. I think it's a really interesting question, actually, because in one part he was amazing, conceptual artist, but in the other hand he was incredible in terms of how he used the materials, the tools that he had. And what's great is the two kind of really balances really well. And I'm not at all anywhere near as kind of successful trying to kind of achieve that. For me, the visual language and the use of materials is how I can kind of put across my thoughts. But he was able to kind of use words as well as,
But I want to ask you all, and they want the last question, which is not very serious at the same time. I remember the work I did for the BBC, I had to interview Nicholas Penning about the Veronese show. And he said, at the end of the day, Veronese is the greatest decorative artist that history has produced. And actually, we shouldn't be embarrassed by that. That the word decorative actually has been diminished and abused, but actually decorative can be, not is, but in Veronese, can be a description of high value. If it was said of your work that it was decorative, Peter, would you be appalled?
No, I'll be happy with that, because in my work it's a search for pattern, and there's nothing derogatory about that, because in life we search for patterns. In science, there's search for patterns, study of nature, literature. We've evolved being able to appreciate patterns.
John?
If I answer this slightly obliquely, because really we're talking about the sort of content of art, aren't we? And I often wonder about this. In the Second World War, Picasso and Matisse. Now, Picasso, in a sense, takes on the issue of the war, Guernica, and then pictures of skulls and things as expressive of the situation. Matisse does completely the opposite. And I think what's in his mind is, this is a terrible situation, we've got to do positive things and make work which is wonderful to look at and keep optimistic. And what would I do? I don't know.
French needed an artist entirely and therefore this one thing with Greek or Irish just
John, get off the fence. You need Picasso.
I think I would be with Matisse. Actually, I think I mean, I would, yes, I think. Well,
Richard?
I think if someone called my work decorative, if I thought they were coming to that with good intentions and an interest in my work, then I'd be happy to accept it. If I think they were coming at it because they didn't like my work and in a sneering tone, it would probably upset me.
John?
Well, it can be a term.
It's dismissive, can't be, oh, that's merely decorative. But there's another sense to the word to decorate. You know, a lot of these objects have decorated the spaces of wealthy collectors. So there's also that idea of a trophy or a prize. But you know, as long as they're decorations that make you think, I think that's the most important thing.
I think so. I think you're right. I mean, it's, you know, I'm really inspired by decorative art because it creates a space, an experience that I'm really after, kind of seeking in my work. So again, it depends how they use, you know, or how that word is used in terms of my.
You don't mind being described as very nice?
I think my work has been described as decorative, especially the earlier work, when I was kind of researching colour. But again, you know, I kind of look at it as a positive. I look at it as something that's kind of full of, you know, lush, kind of depth, colour, and all of those things that are in the work. So.
Can I thank, at least for me, what's been a fascinating and honest conversation between these 5 artists. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And Hans, maybe you want to say something at the end?
Thank you.
And we should add Rotary and Natalie, who are here on the front, who have been with us in every way possible. So could I thank you all?
Just before we finish, I just want to thank firstly Philip Dodd for doing such a